The year was 1886, and the air in the high meadows of the Colorado Territory already held the sharp, clean promise of an early autumn. Elara Vance, who was 18 years old but felt she carried the weight of a woman twice that age, stood knee-deep in the cold, rushing water of Clear Creek. She did not shiver, though the water numbed her ankles and turned the hem of her wool skirt into a heavy, sodden weight. Her focus was absolute, fixed on the stones she held in her raw hands. They were not random stones, gathered haphazardly from the bank. Each one had been selected with a specific purpose in mind, flat on at least two sides, heavy enough to resist the current, and shaped to interlock with its neighbors. She was building something in the creek, a low, V-shaped wall that narrowed the water's flow, and to anyone who happened by, it looked like the pointless, frantic labor of a girl unhinged by circumstance. 3 months prior, her father, a man whose piety was as hard and unyielding as the granite bluffs that framed the valley, had cast her out for a transgression he deemed unforgivable. Her mother had died of fever the winter before, and upon her father's remarriage, Elara had spoken plainly against the new woman's casual cruelty toward her younger siblings. For this, she was disowned. But when she had walked away from the homestead with her small bundle of belongings, 10-year-old Leo and 6-year-old Cora had followed her, their small faces pale with a loyalty that both fortified and terrified her. Now they were her responsibility, 3 of them living in a hastily patched lean-to against a clay embankment, with winter approaching like a slow, white predator. It was Hiram Poole who saw her first. He was a man whose view of the world was measured in cordwood, bushels of corn, and the straightness of a fence line. He reined in his horse at the edge of the creek, his face a mask of stern disapproval as he watched Elara wrestle another heavy stone into place. The 2 children were on the bank, gathering smaller rocks in a bucket, their movements mirroring her own focused intensity. Hiram cleared his throat, a sound like gravel grinding. "Miss Vance," he called out, his voice carrying easily over the murmur of the water. Elara straightened slowly, her back aching in a long, continuous line of fire. She did not offer a smile, only a nod. "Mr. Poole," she replied, her voice steady. He gestured with a leather-gloved hand at the half-finished structure in the water. "What is the meaning of this foolishness? You have a shelter to finish, wood to split. Winter doesn't wait for a woman to finish playing with rocks." His words were not meant to be cruel. In his mind, they were practical, a necessary corrective to what he saw as a dangerous waste of precious time and energy. His wife Dorothea had already declared it a tragedy, telling the other women at the trading post that poor Elara Vance, burdened with 2 children she had no business raising, had clearly gone soft in the head. It was a pity, she would say, a deep and terrible pity, her voice laced with the grim satisfaction of a prophecy fulfilling itself. The skepticism of the valley settled around Elara like a fine dust, present in every glance and whispered conversation. Hiram Poole represented the voice of practical, masculine reason, which saw value only in proven methods. To him, survival was a formula. You built a square cabin, you plowed a straight furrow, you shot your meat with a rifle. What Elara was doing was alien, an equation with variables he could not comprehend, and therefore, it had to be wrong. Dorothea Weiss and the other women embodied the community's chorus of pity and doubt. They saw a young woman overwhelmed, making poor decisions out of grief and desperation. They sent over small parcels of food, a loaf of bread, a jar of preserves, gestures that felt less like charity and more like offerings to the unfortunate, a way of acknowledging her impending failure from a safe distance. Even Ruth Hartley, a widow herself who lived on the neighboring claim, watched with a quiet, cautious reserve. She never joined the gossip, her gaze holding a measure of curiosity rather than judgment. But she offered no words of encouragement either. She stood as the open-minded witness, waiting for proof, reserving her belief as a commodity too precious to be spent on a mere possibility. Elara felt their collective gaze on her back as she worked, a physical weight of disapproval. In her mind, it mingled with the remembered voice of her father, a constant echo of his rigid doctrines. "The Lord provides for those who follow his path," he would have thundered, "not for those who stray into fanciful notions." But Elara's idea was not fanciful. It was a principle, one learned not from scripture or sermon, but from her mother. Her mother had been a quiet woman, a reader of seasons and signs, a student of the natural world's unwritten laws. She had possessed a different kind of faith, one rooted in the predictable rhythms of the earth. She had taken Elara to this very creek as a child, not to fish with a line, but to watch. "Everything that lives follows a path of least resistance, Elara," she had said, her voice as soft as the moss on the river stones. "The water finds the lowest ground. The deer find the easiest trail. And the fish," she had pointed with a long, elegant finger, "they follow the current. In the autumn, when the air grows cold, the trout move upstream to the spawning beds. They swim against the current, yes, but they still seek the deepest, surest channel. If you make one channel the easiest path, they will take it." It was a lesson in hydrodynamics and animal behavior, taught not with grand words, but with patient observation. Watching an outcome, her mother had taught her, was not the same as understanding the principle. Anyone could see a fish caught on a hook, but true knowledge came from understanding why the fish was there in the first place. The second principle was for the winter. Her mother had pointed to the south-facing hillsides in late autumn, where the last stubborn patches of green held out against the encroaching frosts. "The sun is a miser in winter," she'd explained. "It gives little, so you must learn where it gives the most. A south-facing slope drinks in every bit of light, and the earth holds that warmth like a sleeping animal, deep in its bones." This was the secret of their shelter. It was not a cave, not really. It was a dugout, an excavation into the dense clay bank that her lean-to currently rested against. The principle was thermal mass. A timber cabin, no matter how well chinked, was a thin skin against the ferocious cold of a mountain winter. It shed heat almost as fast as a fire could produce it. But the earth itself was a vast reservoir of stable temperature. Dig down a few feet, and the ground remained a constant, cool temperature, untouched by the howling blizzards on the surface. Her plan was to carve a home directly from that stability, insulated by the very ground that others saw only as dirt. The earth would be her walls, her ceiling, her greatest defense. It would not be warm, not in the way a roaring fire was warm, but it would never be fatally cold. It would be a shelter that required minimal fuel and offered absolute security from the wind. She tried to explain it once, to Hiram Poole. He had returned a week after his first visit, his expression even more grim, seeing that she had not abandoned her project in the creek, but had nearly completed it. "The trout will run soon," she said, looking not at him, but at the funnel of stones she had built. "They swim upstream. The weir doesn't block them, it guides them. The water flows fastest through the narrow point, and they will follow it, right into the holding pen." She pointed to a small enclosed area at the V's apex, woven from willow branches. Hiram squinted, his mind unable to accept a logic that did not involve bait and hook. "Fish go where they please, Miss Vance. You cannot tell a fish where to swim with a pile of rocks. It is luck and persistence that fills a smokehouse, not this water witching." He dismissed her explanation with a wave of his hand. He saw a dam that was not a dam, a trap with no lure. He saw chaos where she saw order, chance where she saw predictable behavior. His world was one of brute force and direct action. Her world, the one her mother had shown her, was one of gentle persuasion, of working with nature's tendencies rather than against them. He rode away that day convinced she was a lost cause, a fool leading 2 children to a winter of starvation. The work on the weir was a slow, painful education in leverage and endurance. Elara learned the unique character of the creek bed, where the current was swiftest, where the eddies formed, and where the largest, most stable rocks had settled. She would spend an hour searching for the perfect stone, then another half hour wrestling it from the muddy bank, using a stout branch as a lever. Wading into the frigid water, she would drag the stone into position, her muscles screaming in protest. The cold was a constant, aching presence, seeping into her bones. She worked until the sun began to dip behind the western peaks, her hands swollen and scraped, her legs numb. Leo and Cora became her assistants, their small hands surprisingly nimble at weaving the willow branches for the trap, their sharp eyes adept at spotting the right kind of flat stones along the shallows. They worked not with the grim silence of drudgery, but with a quiet, shared purpose. They trusted her, and their trust was a fuel that burned hotter than her exhaustion. Day by day, the V-shaped walls grew, a dark, jagged line of stone that subtly but irrevocably altered the creek's ancient path, creating a new, more inviting channel that led to a single, inescapable point. When the weir was complete, she turned her attention to the earth. The dugout was a task of a different order, not of resisting a current, but of moving a mountain one shovelful at a time. The lean-to was dismantled, its precious timbers set aside. Armed with a rusty spade and her father's old pickaxe, Elara began to carve into the south-facing clay bank. The first layer was topsoil, dark and rich and threaded with a web of tough roots that had to be severed with the axe. Below that, she hit the dense, ochre-colored clay. It was heavy, unforgiving work. Each swing of the pickaxe jarred her arms to the shoulder. Each shovelful of clay felt like lifting lead. The sun beat down on her back, and sweat stung her eyes, tracing clean paths through the grime on her face. Leo, too small to swing the pickaxe, used a bucket to haul the excavated earth away from the entrance, building it up into low berms on either side that would help deflect the wind and snow. Cora's job was to bring them water and to keep watch over their small pile of supplies. The growing hollow in the hillside became their entire world. It smelled of damp earth, of severed roots, of the deep, cool breath of the subterranean world. The process was methodical, almost geological in its slowness. She was careful to keep the walls as straight as possible, the ceiling a shallow arch for strength. She learned the language of the soil, recognizing the streaks of gravel that signaled softer digging and the dense, compacted layers that fought her every inch. After 2 weeks of relentless labor, she had carved out a space roughly 10 feet wide and 12 feet deep. It was not a large space, but it felt immense, a cavern of their own making. Now came the structural work. She used the salvaged timbers from the lean-to and a few logs scavenged from a lightning-felled pine to frame an entrance. The door was a crude affair, planks from a broken crate nailed together, but it was solid. The most critical part was the roof. She laid smaller logs across the top of the entrance frame, extending back to the earth ceiling. Over these, she layered thick sheets of bark she had peeled from fallen aspens. And then came the final, ingenious step. She cut bricks of sod from the meadow, thick squares of grass and roots and soil, and laid them carefully over the bark and log ceiling, packing them tightly together. The sod roof would provide insulation, and in the spring, the grass would grow, knitting the roof into a living part of the hillside itself. Inside, the dugout was a world transformed. The air was still and cool, the silence profound. The howling of the wind, a constant companion outside, was reduced to a distant, muted sigh. Light filtered in only through the open doorway, leaving the back of the space in perpetual twilight. With the last of her energy, Elara used the spade to carve out features from the clay walls. She shaped 3 sleeping platforms, raised a few inches off the floor to keep them from the deepest chill. In one wall, she carved out a small hearth, and with painstaking care, she dug a narrow flue that angled up through the clay and the sod roof, lining it with flat stones. It was a small fireplace, designed for a small, efficient fire, not a wasteful, roaring blaze. It was not a home by Hiram Poole's standards, but as Elara lit a tiny fire for the first time and watched the smoke draw perfectly up the flue, she felt a sense of security that no timber cabin, with its drafty corners and insatiable appetite for firewood, could ever have provided. They moved their few belongings inside: 2 woolen blankets, a cast-iron pot, the bucket, and a small sack of flour. That night, as the 3 of them lay on their earthen platforms, the profound silence of the deep earth wrapped around them like the safest of blankets. The first test arrived with the turning of the aspen leaves. A cold snap descended from the high peaks, and the valley awoke one morning to a crystalline layer of frost on every surface. This was the signal. The trout, driven by ancient instinct, would begin their upstream journey. Elara felt a tremor of anxiety, a cold knot in her stomach that had nothing to do with the morning air. Her entire theory, her mother's wisdom, the weeks of back-breaking labor, it all rested on this moment. She took Leo and Cora to the creek bank, and they waited. The water, now achingly clear, rushed through the stone channel she had built. For hours, nothing happened. The sun climbed higher, melting the frost. The silence was broken only by the creek's murmur and the distant call of a jay. Leo fidgeted, his faith beginning to waver. Cora drew patterns in the dirt with a stick. Elara remained still, her gaze locked on the water, forcing herself to trust the principle. It was a profound test of faith, not in a distant deity, but in the observable, repeatable laws of the world she inhabited. And then she saw it. A flicker of movement, a flash of silver against the dark stones of the creek bed. It was a single trout, fighting its way up the current. Then another, and another. Within the hour, the vanguard of the run had arrived. A steady stream of fish, sleek and powerful, entered the wider mouth of her weir. She held her breath as they approached the narrowing V. Just as her mother had predicted, they did not fight the funnel. They sought the strongest current, the path of least resistance. And that path now led directly through the narrow opening and into the woven willow trap. The trap, which had looked so empty and flimsy, was suddenly alive with thrashing, silver bodies. Leo let out a whoop of pure joy, and Cora clapped her hands, her eyes wide with wonder. Elara felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled her knees. She waded into the cold water, her hands sure and steady as she opened the small gate on the trap. She did not take them all. This was not a slaughter. It was a harvest. She selected 4 of the largest trout, securing them on a string, and then opened the gate wider, allowing the rest to continue their journey upstream. She was not just a taker, she was a steward of the system she had created, a participant in the creek's life, not merely a predator. The second crucible came a month later. The sky turned a flat, bruised gray, and the wind began to moan through the pines, a low, mournful sound that promised violence. The first snowflakes, large and wet, began to fall. By nightfall, the valley was in the grip of a full-blown blizzard. This was the test for the dugout, the trial by ice and wind. Outside, the world dissolved into a howling chaos of white. The wind shrieked like a banshee, rattling the crude plank door in its frame. But inside their earthen home, the storm was a distant rumor. The thick clay walls absorbed the sound, reducing the gale's fury to a dull, bass rumble. Elara kept a small, steady fire in the hearth, feeding it with seasoned aspen sticks no thicker than her wrist. It was just enough to take the chill from the air, to cast a warm, flickering glow on the clay walls. She placed her hand against the wall farthest from the fire. It was cool to the touch, but it was not the biting, soul-leeching cold of a cabin wall. It was the neutral, constant temperature of the deep earth. She could feel the immense thermal mass of the hillside around them, a shield that no winter storm could ever breach. The children, who in previous storms had huddled together shivering under a single blanket, were sleeping soundly on their platforms, their breathing deep and even. They were safe. They were warm enough. The principle had held. The moment of vindication was a quiet, internal affair. As the blizzard raged outside, Elara sat by the small fire, the smell of smoking trout from a makeshift rack near the flue filling their small home. She tasted it, the rich, oily flesh, preserved by the cool smoke, and it was the taste of survival, the flavor of a correct hypothesis. This was the sensory proof, the undeniable evidence that her mother's knowledge was true. The warmth she felt was not just from the fire. It was the warmth of an idea proven correct, of a desperate gamble that had paid off. She thought of Hiram Poole's drafty cabin, of the massive fire he would need to be feeding just to keep the cold at bay. She thought of the community's pity, of their certainty that she would fail. There was no triumph in her heart, no desire to gloat. There was only a deep, quiet satisfaction, a profound connection to the mother who had taught her to see the world not as a series of random events, but as a system of beautiful, interlocking principles. She had not conquered nature. She had simply learned its language and had the courage to speak it. The blizzard lasted for 3 days. When it finally broke, the world was buried under a thick blanket of silent, pristine snow. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue. On the 4th day, a figure appeared, struggling through the deep drifts. It was Hiram Poole. His face was gaunt, his beard iced over. He stopped before the entrance to the dugout, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and disbelief. He had expected to find a frozen mound, a tomb for a foolish girl and 2 children. Instead, he saw a wisp of smoke curling from a stone-lined hole in the snow-covered hill, and the entrance to the dugout was clear, protected by the berms of earth Elara had built. He had come out of a grim sense of duty to check on the dead, but also out of desperation. The wind had torn a section of roof from his own barn, and his supply of firewood was dwindling at an alarming rate. Elara opened the door and stepped out into the blinding light. She simply looked at him, waiting. The cold air hit her, a stark contrast to the stable coolness of the dugout. Hiram's gaze went past her, into the dim interior. He could see the children, awake and bundled but not shivering. He could smell the lingering scent of smoked fish. His eyes, accustomed to the stark realities of winter hardship, took in the scene with a slow, dawning comprehension. He saw not a damp, miserable hole, but a sanctuary. He saw not starvation, but providence. He looked from the dugout to the creek, where the top of her weir was just visible above the snow-covered banks. He finally met her eyes. His own were filled with a weary, hard-won respect. "I'll be," he said, his voice rough with cold and something else. The grating sound of a long-held certainty being shattered. It worked. It all actually worked. It was the most profound apology he was capable of making. Elara did not say, "I told you so." The victory was too significant for such small words. She simply nodded and stepped aside. "Your family has enough wood?" she asked. He shook his head, the admission costing him a visible measure of his pride. "We're burning furniture," he confessed, "and our stores are low." Elara went back inside and returned with a bundle wrapped in cloth. It was 4 large, smoked trout. She handed it to him. He took it, the weight of it in his hands a tangible symbol of his misjudgment. "I don't understand how," he said, looking again at the dugout. This is just the hole in the ground." Elara looked at the hillside, at the smooth, snow-covered roof that was now indistinguishable from the surrounding landscape. "The earth holds its own warmth, Mr. Poole," she said simply. "You just have to get deep enough to feel it." That spring, after the thaw, Hiram Poole came to her again. He did not come alone. 2 other homesteaders were with him, their expressions humbled and curious. They asked her about the weir. She took them down to the creek, which was now swollen with meltwater, and showed them the stonework, explaining how the V had to be angled just so, how the trap needed to be woven to allow smaller fish to escape. She did not hoard her knowledge. She gave it away freely, just as her mother had given it to her. She explained the principle, that it was easier to guide a thing along its natural path than to force it onto a new one. They listened, not with the condescending patience of men indulging a woman, but with the focused attention of students. That summer, 2 more weirs were built on creeks in the valley, their designs based on hers. When Ruth Hartley came to visit, bringing a small bag of precious sewing needles, she looked at the neat stacks of smoked fish in Elara's dugout and smiled a genuine, open smile. "My husband always said there were 2 kinds of smart," Ruth said. "The kind that comes from books and the kind that comes from watching. Your mother had the second kind, and so do you." It was the first true praise Elara had received from another woman, and it warmed her more than any fire. The story of Elara Vance and her winter of innovation became a quiet legend in that valley, a cautionary tale against the arrogance of conventional wisdom. The dugout she had carved from the clay bank served her and the children for 3 more winters. By then, with the steady supply of fish to eat and to trade, and with the respect she had earned, she was able to secure help in building a proper timber house on the flat ground just above the bank. The dugout, no longer a home, was converted into the finest root cellar in the county, its constant cool temperature keeping potatoes and carrots fresh well into the spring. The Vance Weir, as it came to be known, was replicated up and down the watershed, a simple, elegant piece of engineering that provided a reliable source of food for generations, helping the small community not just to survive, but to thrive. Her knowledge, born of a mother's quiet observation and a daughter's desperate courage, was passed down, becoming a new tradition, a piece of practical wisdom woven into the very fabric of the place, as enduring as the stones that still sat in the creek, silently guiding the way home.